We sent her with a white flag. We gave her the finest ship humanity had ever built, filled it with gifts, and loaded her mind with 40 years of studied alien language. We gave her our best words, our most careful sentences, and our deepest hope. We told her she was going to change everything. We told her the galaxy was about to learn our name. We sent Ambassador Dr. Lin Pham into the dark, and we cheered, and we cried, and we watched her ship shrink into a point of light and disappear. We did not send her to die. I am Admiral Yara Osei. I have commanded warships in 4 conflicts, buried soldiers whose names I still say out loud when the station goes quiet, and held the rank of Supreme Commander long enough to understand that power is mostly the ability to make decisions that will hurt people you care about. I have never been a soft person. My crew will tell you that. My family would tell you that, if I still had one close enough to ask. But I remember standing at the observation window of UEN Strategic Command on the night the Reconciliation launched, watching that ship climb through Earth's orbit, with its running lights blinking gold against the black. And I felt something I had not felt since I was a child watching shuttle launches with my grandmother, on a dusty screen in her kitchen in Accra. I felt something that had no military word for it. I felt it was going to be all right. Lynn had come to my office 3 days before departure. She was not tall. She wore her silver-streaked hair pinned back without ceremony, and she sat across from my desk and placed both hands flat on the surface, as if steadying herself for a medical procedure. She did not look frightened. She looked like someone who had already made their peace with every possible outcome and had chosen to move forward anyway. She said, "I know what you think of this mission, Admiral." I said, "Tell me what I think." She smiled. It was a small, honest smile. "You think it is optimistic to the point of danger. You think the Imperium will see the reconciliation as a provocation. You think sending one unarmed ship to a civilization that has never acknowledged our existence is either the bravest thing humanity has ever done or the most foolish." I looked at her for a moment. "Which do you think it is?" She did not hesitate. "Both," she said. "That is exactly why I volunteered." I had reviewed her file many times by then. 16 languages, 30 years in xenolinguistics. She had been the one to crack the Imperium's navigational frequency patterns, which gave us the first real proof that they knew we existed, and had simply chosen not to care. She had spent a decade building the translation matrix that sat in the Reconciliation's communication core, a system that could render human speech into Imperium standard in under 2 seconds, with 94% tonal accuracy. She was the only person alive who could speak to them, and have it mean something. I told her that. I also told her the Imperium's record with what they called pre-sovereign organism clusters, which was their term for any species that had not yet been granted legal standing in their galactic hierarchy. The record was not encouraging. 11 species had made formal contact attempts in the last 2 centuries. Of those 11, 6 were functionally extinct. The remaining 5 existed in various grades of servitude, classified under the Imperium's biological registry, not as civilizations, but as managed biological resources. Lynn listened to all of this without moving. Then she said, "They have a legal code, centuries old, written during their first expansion period. It includes specific protections for diplomatic envoys from any species capable of language. We found it in the broadcast archives 4 years ago. They wrote it themselves. All we have to do is stand in front of them and speak." I said, "And if they don't honor their own laws?" She looked at me steadily. "Then the universe will know they don't," she said, "and so will we. And that will matter too." I approved the mission that afternoon, not because I was convinced it would work. I approved it because Lin Pham was right that it mattered either way, and because humanity had spent 40 years watching this civilization from a careful distance, and the watching had to end sometime. Because we had built the Reconciliation with everything we knew about what the Imperium respected, and we had dressed it in the colors of formal petition, and we had loaded it with the mathematical proof of our sentience, our history, our art, our grief, our curiosity, and everything else we had decided defined us when we were asked to put it all in a single vessel. Because Lynn asked to go, and because I believed her when she said she was not afraid. The morning of the launch, I stood at the window for 4 hours. Half the planet was watching. Schools had cleared their schedules. The broadcast was carried on every network Earth had. I watched the mission feed tick through its pre-departure sequence, and I watched the reconciliation undock from Meridian Station and begin its slow turn toward open space. And I thought about all the times in human history we had sent someone forward into the unknown on behalf of everyone behind them. I thought about the first sailors who crossed oceans with no maps. I thought about the first people who climbed into tin cans on top of controlled explosions and trusted that the math would hold. I thought about every letter ever sent from a battlefield by someone who knew the odds and sent it anyway. I thought, we have always been this kind of species, the kind that goes. The reconciliation's drive ignited, and she was moving, and then she was gone, and the observation room was very quiet for a long time. Commander Peter Slade, my second in command, came and stood beside me and did not say anything, which was the right choice. Peter understood silence. He had grown up on a research station in the outer belt, where silence was just what space sounded like, and he had learned to treat it with respect. After a while he said quietly, "Do you want to know my honest assessment?" I said no. He nodded. We stood there a while longer. The reconciliation was scheduled to reach the Imperium's nearest border station in 11 days. Lynn planned to request formal permission to enter Imperium space and petition the High Council for recognition of Earth under the Xeno-diplomatic protocols that the Imperium itself had drafted in the 3rd century of its expansion. She had prepared 6 different approaches depending on the initial reception. She had rehearsed every scenario we could build a model for. She had gifts with her, physical gifts, because our cultural analysts believed the Imperium placed high symbolic value on physical craftsmanship. There were works of art, precision instruments, a sealed archive of human music, and a hand-bound collection of mathematical proofs that our best minds had compiled specifically for this moment. Everything wrapped and catalogued and labeled in Imperium standard. She also carried a personal letter from the Secretary General of the United Earth Nations, handwritten on paper made from trees grown in 6 different countries, signed by every living head of state who had agreed to this mission, which was all of them. I went back to my desk. I began reviewing the quarterly readiness reports for the UEN Outer Patrol, because that was my job, and the work did not stop because history was happening. I answered messages. I reviewed supply chains. I approved a crew rotation for the patrol vessels along the heliopause boundary. On day 7, we received a brief automated signal from the reconciliation, confirming it had dropped from faster-than-light travel at the edge of Imperium-monitored space and was beginning its formal approach. The signal included a short personal note from Lynn, which she had written for the mission log. It said, "The stars look the same from here. I find that comforting. Proceeding as planned. Tell everyone at home to keep the light on." I printed it and pinned it to the wall beside my desk. On day 11, the reconciliation reached the Imperium border station. On day 11, she was surrounded by 12 warships before she finished decelerating. The alarm on my console was a soft tone, not a klaxon, because we had coded the mission monitoring system to avoid anything that sounded like panic. But my hand was already on the comm before the tone finished. Peter's voice came through immediately. He had been in the monitoring room all night. He said, "Admiral, they have weapons locked on the reconciliation. No communication from the Imperium. No hails. No response to our diplomatic frequency. 12 capital vessels, all armed. They moved to intercept the moment she dropped from FTL." I said, "Is she broadcasting the diplomatic identifier?" He said, "On every frequency. Continuously. They know exactly who she is." I stood up from my desk. I crossed to the window. The observation port faced away from the reconciliation's heading and showed me only the curve of Earth below and the cold, ordinary dark above it. I said, "Get me a direct line to the mission feed. Now." The feed came through in 2 seconds. It showed the reconciliation small and pale in the center of the screen, and the 12 Imperium warships arrayed around it like the fingers of a closing hand. The reconciliation was not moving. Lynn had done exactly the right thing, which was stop, hold position, and keep broadcasting. The Imperium ships were not moving either. For 43 minutes, nothing happened. I stood at the feed and watched and said nothing, and thought nothing useful. Peter stood beside me. The monitoring room had filled with staff who were pretending to be busy and were actually watching the same screen. Nobody spoke. Then the Imperium ships moved. Not to open fire, not immediately. They moved to close the gap, surrounding the reconciliation on all sides, And then one of them, the largest, a vessel 3 times the length of our biggest carrier, extended what our analysts had previously identified as a boarding mechanism. I said, "She is unarmed. She is displaying full diplomatic protocol. They know. They know exactly what she is." Peter said, very quietly, "Yes." The feed cut to static 4 minutes later. I kept my hand on the console for a long time after that. The room behind me had gone completely silent. Not the silence of space. The silence of people who understood that something had just changed, and did not yet know the shape of it, and were afraid to breathe in case breathing somehow made it more real. I turned around. Every face in the room was looking at me. 23 people, each of them waiting. I said, "Get me the Secretary General. Get me every fleet commander on active duty. Get me a full read on Imperium vessel positions along our monitoring perimeter." I paused. "And someone get Reza Sharif on the line. I need him awake and in front of a screen in the next 10 minutes. Peter was already moving. The room was moving. Everyone had something to do now, and doing things was better than standing still in the silence. I turned back to the static on the feed and left it running. In my career I had learned that the worst thing about waiting for bad news was not the waiting. It was the moment just before, when you already knew, and the universe had not caught up yet. The strange suspended second when the math was done, but the answer had not been spoken aloud. Lin Pham was the bravest person our species had ever produced. I had known that the moment she sat down across from my desk and put both hands flat on the surface and looked at me without fear, I stood at the static screen and said her name once, quietly, to myself. Then I went back to work. The transmission came 19 hours later. We did not find it. They sent it to us. It arrived on every frequency Earth monitored, every satellite array, every deep space relay buoy in the outer system. It arrived simultaneously on military channels and civilian networks and the personal devices of 2 billion people who were eating breakfast, or putting their children to bed, or sitting in traffic, or doing the 10,000 ordinary things that people do on a Tuesday morning, when the world is still the world they recognize. The Galactic Imperium had been watching us for 60 years. They had learned our languages, our broadcast formats, our compression protocols. They knew exactly how to make sure we all received it at the same time. They knew exactly how to make sure none of us could look away. The transmission lasted 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I am not going to describe it in full. I will not do that to you, and I will not do it to her. I will tell you only what is necessary for you to understand what happened next, and what humanity decided, and why. The Imperium had a ritual they used for what they called biological contamination events. When a species attempted unauthorized contact with their civilization, they responded with what their protocols called a purification rite. It was not a weapon, it was a ceremony. That distinction, in their cultural framework, was extremely important to them. A weapon implied an enemy worth fighting. A ceremony implied a formality, a routine procedure, something done not in anger, but in administration. They performed the purification rite on the Reconciliation's crew, all 12 of them. And they kept Lin for last, because their intelligence told them she was the senior diplomat, and their protocol specified that the senior representative of any contacting species should be the final and most visible part of the ceremony, to ensure maximum communicative effect. They wanted us to understand what they were doing and why. They had done it 10 times before with other species. It had always achieved the intended result, which was silence. Before the feed cut to static in that final second, before whatever they used to suppress the broadcast took full effect, Lin Pham looked directly into the camera she had set up in the Reconciliation's communication bay. She had known this might happen. She had prepared for it. She had decided what she wanted to say. She said, "Tell them we were here." 5 words. Clear, calm, and completely steady. Then the static. I was in the monitoring room when the full transmission reached us. I watched it once. I made myself watch it completely, because it was my duty to know exactly what had been done, and to carry that knowledge forward without flinching. That is what command means. You carry the things other people should not have to carry, so that they can keep functioning. When it was over, I stood very still for a moment. Then I turned to the room. I said, "Lock down the external communication arrays. Nothing goes out from this facility for the next 20 minutes. I need 20 minutes. Peter said, "Admiral, The civilian networks already have the full feed. The Secretary General's office is calling. Every fleet commander in the system is requesting. I said, 20 minutes, Peter. He held my gaze. He nodded. I walked to the small office off the main monitoring floor, the one I used when I needed to think without an audience, and I closed the door, and I stood in the middle of that room in the dark, and I gave myself exactly what I had asked for. 20 minutes. I thought about Lin Fam. I thought about 11 other species. I thought about the 6 that no longer existed as civilizations, and the 5 that existed now only in service to those who had decided they were lesser. I thought about what the Imperium's transmission was designed to do, which was to make humanity afraid, and to make that fear feel so large and so permanent that resistance would seem not just impossible but absurd. I thought about the fact that they had sent the transmission to civilian networks, not just military, not just government. They had sent it to the personal devices of people eating breakfast. I thought, they made a mistake. Not a tactical mistake. Something deeper. Something that told me exactly how little they understood about what they were dealing with. They thought fear was a finishing move. For some species, perhaps it was. Perhaps it had always worked before because the species they faced had been young, or fractured, or had not yet learned the particular lesson that humanity had been forced to learn over and over, across 10,000 years of recorded history. The lesson that goes like this: there is a kind of people who, when you show them the worst thing you can do to them, do not collapse. They get very quiet. They look at each other, and then they get to work. I opened the door. Peter was right there. He had known I would be ready. I said, "Get me the Secretary General. Get me every fleet commander. Get me Dr. Reza Sharif, on a secure line in the next 5 minutes." I straightened my jacket, and pull up the full Imperium navigational beacon survey. I want everything Reza's team has built on the quantum relay network. Every node, every gap, every single point of failure. Peter said, "Are we going to war?" I said, "We are going to give them an answer." I walked back into the monitoring room. The screens were full of incoming signals, fleet commanders waiting, the Secretary General's office, news networks, emergency channels, a dozen nations all asking the same question at the same time. On every screen and in every signal and in every question, I heard the same thing underneath. What do we do? I sat down at the primary console. I pulled up the fleet readiness overview. I looked at 4,000 vessels across the inner and outer system, staffed by people who had woken up that morning to the same transmission the rest of the planet had received, and who were sitting at their stations right now waiting for someone to tell them what this moment was going to mean. I thought of Lynn, sitting across my desk with both hands flat on the surface, steady, decided, already past fear and into something that moved differently. I opened the fleet-wide channel. I said, "This is Admiral Yara Osei. Every commanding officer in the UEN fleet is to report to full readiness status immediately. You have all seen the transmission. You know what was done. You know to whom it was done, and why." I paused for exactly 1 second. "We are going to respond. Not in panic. Not in grief. We are going to respond the way Lin Fam would have wanted us to respond, which is with complete, deliberate, and total precision. Begin readiness protocols now. Further orders to follow." I closed the channel. The room around me was moving. Every station was lit. Every console was active. The machinery of humanity was waking up, and it was not waking up slowly, and it was not waking up afraid. Outside the window, Earth turned in the dark the way it always had. I kept the static feed running on the secondary screen. I left it there. I looked at it sometimes when I needed to remember exactly what this was for. Somewhere out in the black, the Galactic Imperium was waiting for the silence they had always gotten before. They were waiting for the fear to settle, for the transmissions to stop, for the small blue species at the edge of their territory to go quiet the way the others had. They were going to wait a long time. We had been taught by every hard thing that had ever happened to us, by every war, every disaster, every moment when the right response was to stand up and keep going. We had been forged in 10,000 years of figuring out how to survive things that should have ended us. We had built cities, and torn them down, and built better ones. We had made mistakes that cost millions of lives, and then made laws to prevent those mistakes from happening again. We were not a perfect species. We had never claimed to be. But we were the kind of species that, when you burned our ambassador alive and sent us the video, did not go silent. We started counting. We counted every ship we had, every weapon, every scientist with an idea that had been waiting for a reason, every engineer who had spent a decade studying Imperium hull composition just in case, every pilot who had been training in silence, every strategist who had been running simulations that officially did not exist, every quiet, patient human being who had looked at the galaxy from a safe distance and thought, one day we are going to need to be ready for this. We counted 90 days. Because the Imperium had given us 90 days before their culling fleet would arrive. Their ultimatum was delivered as a formality. They expected compliance. They had always gotten compliance. They had given us 90 days, because in their experience, 90 days was more than enough time for a pre-sovereign species to understand that resistance was biologically irrational. They did not know what we could build in 90 days. They did not know what we were. Reza Sharif was a small, precise man who kept his workspace extremely organized and spoke very quickly when he was excited, which was almost always. He had been working on what he called the null array for 6 years, and for most of that time the project had existed in a budget category labeled theoretical infrastructure research, which was the kind of label that kept politicians from asking questions. When I got him on the secure line that night, he was already awake. He had already seen the transmission. His eyes behind his glasses were very bright, not with excitement exactly, but with the specific focused energy of someone who has been waiting for a moment they knew was coming. He said, "You want to know if it works?" I said, "I want to know if it is ready." He said, "The theory is solid. We proved it 3 months ago in the microscale tests. The hardware is 90% complete. I need 8 weeks to finish fabrication, and another 2 for calibration testing." I said, "You have 6 weeks. What do you need?" He did not hesitate. He had a list. He had always had a list. I gave him everything on it. Across the solar system, things were already moving. Shipyards that had been running at standard production capacity shifted to continuous operations within 48 hours of the transmission. Materials that had been in reserve for long-term infrastructure projects were reclassified and rerouted. Scientists who had been working in quiet corners of research facilities on problems that had no immediate military application discovered, very quickly, that their problems now had extremely immediate military application. And people came forward. That was the part I had not fully anticipated, although I should have. The volunteer lists went active 6 hours after my fleet-wide address, and by morning, they had overloaded 3 separate government processing servers. Not just military volunteers, engineers, medics, programmers, teachers who wanted to help however they could, teenagers who were not old enough to serve but sent messages asking what they could do. An 81-year-old retired physicist in Oslo who had spent 40 years studying Imperium energy weapon signatures contacted the research division directly and said she had a working countermeasure design and please could someone look at it today. Someone looked at it that afternoon. It was very good. We used it. In the command centers and on the carriers and in the research labs and in the shipyards, everywhere humans were working toward what was coming, there were pictures of Lin Pham, printed and handwritten and drawn in crayon by children who had sent them to fleet addresses because they wanted the soldiers to have them. Her face everywhere. Her words. "Tell them we were here." The Imperium continued to broadcast reassurances to the rest of the galaxy. They called humanity's mobilization a biological threat display, consistent with observed primate behavioral patterns. They described our activity as elevated but non-strategic. One of their senior military commentators said in a recorded address to the High Council that humans would exhaust themselves in the display phase and cease organized resistance within 30 days. He scheduled a formal victory ceremony for day 91. I watched the clip of that address 3 times. Then I went back to work. Day 30 came and went. We did not cease organized resistance. We added 300 vessels to the operational fleet. Reza Sharif completed fabrication of the null array's primary emitter on day 34 and began calibration tests on day 35, 12 days ahead of schedule. On day 40, Captain Owen Marsh, of the carrier Bright Meridian, forwarded me a message his crew had voted to send. They wanted permission to paint something on the hull of their ship. He included the proposed text. It was Lin's words. I approved it within the hour. I sent the approval to every fleet commander and told them it was open to anyone who wanted it. By day 50, 4,000 hulls carried those 5 words. Tell them we were here. On day 88, with 2 days remaining in the Imperium's ultimatum, the UEN warfleet crossed the border into Imperium space. We did not send a warning. We did not send a message. We did not give them the chance to call it a hostile act in time to prepare for it, because the whole point was that they had already committed the hostile act, and this was not an act of war in search of a justification. This was an answer. Reza was on the secondary bridge of the flagship when the fleet crossed the boundary. He was sitting very still with his hands folded, watching the navigational display, and when I walked past him to the command station, he looked up at me and said, in his quick, precise voice, "Ready on your order." I said, "Not yet. Let them see us first." I wanted them to see us. I wanted the Imperium's border monitoring systems to register 4,000 vessels coming out of faster-than-light travel simultaneously, and I wanted the signal to travel up their chain of command, and I wanted whoever was sitting at the top of that chain to have exactly enough time to understand what was happening before they lost the ability to coordinate a response. 14 seconds. That was how long the signal took to reach the nearest Imperium command relay from the border. I waited 15 seconds. Then I said, "Reza." He nodded. His hands moved. The null array fired. 40 Imperium navigational beacons went dark at the same moment. In Imperium space, faster-than-light travel depended on those beacons, the way a ship in old Earth waters depended on lighthouses. Without them, the quantum calculations that made FTL possible became unreliable to the point of fatal. Every Imperium vessel in the affected zone dropped immediately to sublight speed, not by choice, because the math stopped working. Their border fleet, 80 vessels, suddenly found themselves stationary in normal space, with no coordinated command structure and no way to call for help at faster-than-light speed. Their communication systems worked. Their weapons worked. What did not work was their ability to move in any coordinated way toward us, or away from us, or anywhere. Owen Marsh in the Bright Meridian led the first strike group. I had chosen him because he was the best tactical commander in the fleet, and because I trusted him to do what needed to be done without doing more than that. The objective was not to destroy the border fleet. The objective was to disable it quickly and completely, and move through. It took 6 hours and 14 minutes. The Imperium's border fleet was good. They fought with skill, and with the confidence of a military that had never genuinely lost. But they had been designed to fight other Imperium-class opponents, which meant they had been designed to fight opponents who fought the way the Imperium fought, which was with formal line engagements and documented protocols and weapon systems optimized against known threats. We did not fight the way they expected. We had not designed our weapons to match theirs. We had designed our weapons to go around theirs. We used decoys that mimicked our fleet signatures, then hit from angles their targeting systems had not been built to track. We used debris from the first exchange as cover for the second wave. We used EMP bursts on frequencies they had not protected against, because those frequencies were not part of Imperium's standard weapon design. We fought dirty. We had invented dirty. We had 10,000 years of practice. The 6 hours felt both very long and very short. I watched from the command station of the flagship, which I had named the Lin Fam over the objections of 3 admirals who said it was sentimental. I had told them sentiment was exactly the point. When Owen's voice came through the comm at hour 6 saying, "Border fleet disabled, Admiral. Minimal casualties on our side. Ready to proceed," I did not feel triumph. I felt what I had described to Peter as something colder, something more permanent than triumph. The feeling of a door closing on one kind of world and another kind beginning. I said, "Proceed to Phase 2. Reza, prepare the array for repositioning." Phase 2 was the part that had taken most of the strategic planning, because the Imperium, upon receiving news of the border engagement, would do the predictable thing. They would send their culling fleet, the weapon they used for final responses to resistant species, the 200 most advanced warships in their navy, aimed directly at Earth. We needed them to do that. We needed them aimed at Earth. We needed them moving at a specific angle toward a specific point, because that point was where we had placed the secondary relay buoy for the null array's repositioned emitter, and the culling fleet was going to sail straight into a dead system with no navigational beacons and find themselves surrounded by nothing and going nowhere. The ship that led them there was called the Fallen Star. My tactical team had named her. She was stripped down, minimal crew, volunteers only, broadcasting a false fleet signature that made her look like the UEN's command vessel. She was the most important ship in the operation, and she needed a crew that understood exactly what they were doing and had chosen to do it anyway. I spoke to her captain before departure. His name was Daniel Okafor. He was 34 years old, originally from Lagos, trained at the new Helsinki Fleet Academy, and he had been on my watch list as a future fleet commander for 2 years. He had volunteered for this assignment within 10 minutes of the briefing. I asked him if he was certain. He said, "Admiral, if Lin Pham could walk onto that station alone and unarmed, I can drive a ship in the right direction." I did not have a good response to that. I told him to come back safe. He said, "I intend to." The Fallen Star led the culling fleet on a 16-hour chase. Daniel's crew performed their role with exact precision, staying just fast enough to draw the Imperium forward, just visible enough to keep them committed to the pursuit, broadcasting enough authentic command channel traffic to convince the culling fleet's intelligence systems that they were following the right target. The culling fleet followed them into the dead system at full FTL. Reza fired the array for the second time. 200 ships, dead in space. Navigation gone. FTL gone. Surrounded by the outer wings of the UEN fleet, which had been waiting in position for 11 hours, with full weapons ready, and nothing to do but be patient. Patience. We had always been very good at patience. I opened a direct channel to the culling fleet's command vessel. A long silence. Then a voice, translated by the matrix Lin had built, speaking in the formal register of Imperium military command. It said, "You cannot sustain this. Our full navy will mobilize. You are one species with one solar system. We are 900 systems. You have won a battle. You have not won a war." I said, "We are not here to win a war." Another silence. I said, "Stand down your fleet. All weapons offline. I will give you a course correction that will allow your vessels to return to Imperium space under their own sublight power. It will take some time, but you will arrive. Then you will deliver a message to your High Council." The Imperium commander said, "What message?" I said, "Tell them we are coming. Tell them to have everyone present who holds authority. And tell them that if they want to discuss what happens next, they should begin preparing to make things right." He started to respond. I closed the channel. Behind me, Reza exhaled slowly, the first sign of tension leaving him. Owen's voice came through on the tactical link, reporting all secondary objectives clear. Peter Slade, who had been at my right side through every hour of the operation, turned to look at me, and for the first time in 88 days, I saw him allow himself a small, careful expression of something that was not quite relief, but was close to it. I turned back to the forward screen. Stars everywhere, the way they always were, ordinary and indifferent and beautiful. Daniel Okafor's voice on the comm. Fallen Star reporting all systems nominal. "Admiral, culling fleet fully contained, ready to escort to release point on your order." I said, "Well done, Daniel." He said, "Thank you, Admiral. Any messages for home?" I thought about that. I said, "Tell them we are on our way." The journey to the Imperium High Council's central station took 4 days, at the measured pace I had chosen deliberately. Not rushing, not slowing. Moving at the speed of something that did not need to hurry because it had already done the hard part. I used those 4 days for preparation. Not tactical preparation, though there was some of that. The null array traveled with us, repositioned on a drone platform, and 2 full strike wings flanked the Lin Pham at all times. I was not naive enough to walk into the center of the Imperium civilization without having read everything their own legal archive contained, and without being prepared for the meeting to fail. But the preparation I cared most about was the document we were building. 3 diplomats, 2 historians, 1 xeno-legal scholar, and myself. We worked in shifts. We argued about language for hours at a time. We reviewed Imperium law, their own statutes, their own foundational texts, their own 3-century-old protocols for the treatment of diplomatic representatives from contacting species. We built something solid, something that could last. On the morning of day 4, Peter read through the final draft and set it down on the table, and looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "She would have liked this." I said, "She would have written it better." He nodded. "Yes. But we tried. We named it the FAM Accords." The High Council's station was enormous. I had seen it in Imperium broadcasts 100 times, a structure that looked from a distance like something grown rather than built, all curved surfaces and strange angles, lit from within by a deep amber glow that their culture associated with authority. As we came in on approach, I watched it through the forward screen and thought about how much it had clearly been designed to make visitors feel small. I had spent 20 years commanding warships. I had learned a long time ago that the size of a room does not determine who holds power inside it. The council chamber itself was built for 11. The High Chancellor presided from an elevated position at the center, flanked by the senior voices of the 9 Imperium branches. They were varied in appearance, the Imperium being composed of several species who had achieved sufficient luminance score to be granted senior governance rights, and they looked at us as we entered with expressions that I had learned to read after weeks of studying their broadcast archive. Most of them were calculating, some of them were frightened, which they were trying to hide. A very few were, and I noticed this carefully, genuinely curious. The High Chancellor was not any of those things. He was a tall being, the specific species called Varath, who made up the ruling caste of the Imperium's government, and he sat in his elevated position with the posture of someone who had never in his life needed to make a concession, and was not entirely certain what concession looked like from the inside. He said, in Imperium Standard, which the translation matrix rendered into clear English through my earpiece, "Admiral Oze, you have been very resourceful." I said, "Thank you." He said, "You have demonstrated military capability beyond what our models indicated. We acknowledge this. We are prepared to offer Earth formal recognition as a registered species under Category 4 of the Luminance Framework. This is a significant offer. It grants your people legal standing, freedom of movement in approximately 30% of Imperium space, and protection under standard biological preservation law." He paused, letting the weight of the offer settle. I said, "I have a document for you." I placed the FAM Accords on the formal presentation surface, a physical document, printed and bound, because the Imperium placed symbolic weight on physical craftsmanship. Lynn had known that. I had remembered. The High Chancellor looked at it without touching it. I said, "The FAM Accords require 5 things from the Imperium. First, the complete elimination of the luminance score classification system and all subordinate ranking protocols associated with it. Second, the immediate release and full reparation program for all 5 species currently held under managed resource classification. Third, the formal criminal trial of the individuals responsible for the killing of Ambassador Dr. Lin Pham, conducted under the Imperium's own 300-year-old diplomatic protection statutes, which your own legal archive confirms are still technically active law. Fourth, permanent human observer status on the Imperium High Council, with full voice rights. Fifth, the establishment of a joint Xeno-Diplomatic Commission to be co-chaired by Earth and the 5 liberated species, with authority to review all future first contact procedures." The chamber was very quiet. The High Chancellor said, "These demands are not serious." I said, "They are not demands, they are terms, and they are entirely serious." He said, "You have won 1 engagement. We have 900 systems." I said, "You have 900 systems and a navigational network that I can close down section by section faster than you can recalibrate. You have a military built to fight opponents who fight the way you fight, and we have demonstrated that we do not. You have a legal code you wrote yourself 3 centuries ago that says exactly what you owed Lin Pham when she arrived at your border station, and you know it, and the full text of that code is on page 47 of the document in front of you." Silence. I said, "I am not here to destroy the Imperium. I am here because a woman named Lin Pham walked into the dark with nothing but words, and your civilization did something that your own laws forbid. And I am here because there are 11 species who met your civilization before we did, and 6 of them are gone, and 5 of them are waiting to find out if anyone is ever going to answer when they ask for help." I looked at him steadily. "We are answering." The High Chancellor looked at the FAM Accords. His hands were on the armrests of his position. They were very still. One of the council members to his left, A smaller figure from a species our archive identified as the Shen leaned forward and said something in a dialect too specific for the Matrix to catch fully. The Chancellor's hands moved slightly. He looked at the Shen council member for a long moment. Then he reached forward and picked up the FAM Accords. He read for 9 minutes. No one spoke. When he was done, he set it down. He said, "The third point. The trial. My administration cannot be held criminally responsible for actions conducted under standard purification rite protocol." I said, "Your own law says otherwise. Page 47. Another silence. He said, "If I sign this, the Imperium's internal political structure will require significant recalibration." I said, "Yes." He said, "Several of my current council positions will not survive the reparation framework." I said, "That is between you and them." He looked at me for a long time. I do not know what he was looking for. I sat across from him the way Lin Pham had once sat across from me, with both hands flat on the surface and nothing left to hide. He picked up the binding instrument. He signed the FAM Accords. Not gracefully, not without visible difficulty. His hands were not entirely steady, but he signed, and then he passed the document to the left, and each council member signed in sequence, and the Shen representative, the last to sign, held the document for an extra moment before setting it down, and looked at me, and gave a brief, quiet inclination of the head that the cultural archive told me was what the Shen used to acknowledge a debt honored. I picked up the signed accords. I said, "Thank you." I meant it, not warmly, not as forgiveness, but as something true. Whatever came next, this moment had happened. It was real. I left the chamber with Peter at my side and 12 UEN officers behind me. We walked through the corridor of that enormous station and out to the docking bay, and I heard our footsteps on the floor, and I thought about the first sailors who crossed oceans with no maps, and the first people in tin cans on top of controlled explosions, and every letter from every battlefield by someone who knew the odds. On the Lin Pham, in the communications bay, I opened a fleet-wide channel and then a full broadcast to Earth. I said, "This is Admiral Yara Osei. The FAM Accords have been signed by the Galactic Imperium High Council. The full text is attached to this transmission. The Accords establish human observer status on the High Council, mandate the liberation and reparation of 5 previously classified species, eliminate the luminance score ranking system in full, and open formal criminal proceedings under Imperium law for the actions taken against Ambassador Dr. Lin Pham and her crew." I paused. I said, "I want to be clear about something. We did not do this for recognition. We did not do this for status, or territory, or the satisfaction of winning. We did this because Lin Pham walked into the dark with nothing but words, and the belief that it mattered, and because she was right, and because what was done to her was wrong in every language in the galaxy, including the Imperium's own. We did this so that the next species the Imperium looks down at will know that someone out there will answer when they call. We did this so that somewhere on 11 other worlds, someone might feel something they have not felt in a very long time." I thought of Lin. I thought of her sitting across from me, steady, decided, past fear. I said, "Tell them we were here. We told them. We made sure they would remember." I closed the channel. Peter said quietly, beside me, "What happens now?" I thought about it. The stars outside the viewing port were the same stars they had always been. Ordinary, indifferent, enormous, and full of everything that had not happened yet. I said, "Now we go home, and then we figure out the rest." He nodded. I turned away from the port and walked back to the command station, and sat down, and pulled up the navigational display, and gave the order to set course for Earth. Behind us, the Imperium High Council station shrank, and then was gone. Ahead of us, the stars opened up the way they always had. We flew toward them,